Well, as I said, we have Matthew Mason with us, Associate Professor of History at BYU, and he specializes in United States history and especially the Civil War period of time. He received his BA in History from University of Utah in 1995 and his MA and PhD in History from the University of Maryland. He began teaching here in the fall of 2003 after a year or so at Eastern Michigan University, and he teaches a variety of courses in American history. He's published articles in various national journals, as well as his first book with the University of North Carolina Press. So, Matt, I understand you live in Springville, and you have a wife and 3 daughters, is that correct? 3 daughters. So please welcome Matthew Mason as he talks to us about the Civil War and the blueprint for modern America.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. I do want a note from our sponsors. I saw the sign on the way in. There's no saving of seats in here, so try to avoid that. I'm very, very happy to be with you. I especially am pleased if you're here and we're not coerced to be here. People who take that level of education seriously and want to learn for its own sake is something to be lauded. So appreciate your being here. In many ways, my story today is a simple one, but a very important one in terms of the Civil War's impact on America. If you look at almost every class around the country that is a survey of U.S. history, most universities that don't teach the U.S. survey altogether teach it, like BYU does, in 2 halves. And those halves surround the Civil War and Reconstruction after the war, which usually gets short shrift because you're out of time at the end of the semester or whatever. The U.S. survey here is the U.S. from before it was the U.S. to 1877 and then 1877 thereafter, which puts the Civil War and the Reconstruction, the whole Civil War era, at the very kind of fulcrum of American history. And I'm not here to contest that at all. In fact, I'm here to underscore that idea that the Civil War is in many ways the center kind of pivot of American history. That is true for a variety of ways. What I want to focus on today is the way it's true in terms of who controlled politics in the United States and how that impacted the economic development of the United States. And the trajectory of the story is pretty simple, but bears some analysis in detail. The trajectory is that the South dominated the United States political system and therefore had a disproportionate impact on its economic development before the Civil War, and that the North dominated and had a disproportionate impact on its economic development as well as political systems thereafter, with really important impacts on the way we all live today. I begin my story with Southern dominance, by which we also mean slaveholders' dominance of the federal government. Of course, slaveholders, if you look at the 1860 census, which is more interesting than it sounds, to look at that census, in 1860 they were only 25% of the Southern population, of the free households in the South owned slaves. And big-time slaveholders were a very small subset of that. So that people who owned 20 or more slaves, which is the kind of dividing line that made you a planter, a big-time slaveholder, that's about 3% of Southern households, which is not, of course, the Gone with the Wind image of Southern, it's all slaveholders and all slaves down there. But despite that fact, despite the fact that the big-time slaveholders were a very small subset even of the southern population, they dominated their southern states' government to the point that slavery was off the table as a point of discussion in southern politics at the state level. But they also had an incredible amount of power in the national government. So for evidence of that proposition, for one thing, all the discussions about slavery that centered on slavery expanding, I could use a thing. Sorry. Does this have a pointer thing? Such as the debate over whether Missouri and other parts of the Louisiana Territory would come in, the Great Missouri debates of 1819 through 1821. The South wins in Missouri, the North gets Maine coming in. So you could call that a compromise. It's a pretty pro-Southern compromise, and people read it as such in 1819, 1820. There's an enormous debate over whether Texas will come in, and whether it will be 1 or 5 states, whether it will be free or slave. It comes in as one enormous slave state, after decades of discussion. All this territory, including the territory on which I stand and you sit, that the United States conquered from Mexico. Of course, that's in many ways an enormous conflict over whether that would be slave or free territory. And that is the Great Compromise of 1850, truly a draw. Then the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which brings Kansas and Nebraska in with the possibility of them being slave states, is a total loss from the northern point of view. So if you're kind of keeping score, the North, in all of these sectional conflicts over the expansion of slavery and the expansion of slave territory, wins no debate. The South wins some of them. Most of them are draws, despite the fact that the slaveholders are such a very small percentage of the United States population. Now, of course, Southerners, slaveholders, their first preference would be, Plan A would be to have no debate over slavery. They can't get away with that, so Plan B is to win that debate, and they generally do win, or at least tie, in that debate. I could give you various years, but a nice subset early in the 19th century. Slaveholders representing the South in the District of Columbia, in the federal government. And you can see the numbers there. They dominated the important speakership of the House. They dominated the Ways and Means chair of the House of Representatives, and they were president all the time. This is the era of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. If you look at the kind of extremists, generally the federal government does not employ extremists in very prominent positions. It's dangerous to do so. But there were an enormous number of pro-slavery zealots, including Calhoun, pictured here, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who went openly in Congress and elsewhere and defended slavery as a good thing. It's a positive good. It's designed of God for the benefit of everyone. Everyone should want to be a slave, is the argument that they make publicly. And there's no obstacle. They're on record with this extreme sort of statement in antebellum America, and that never keeps them from holding high federal office, vice president, secretary of state in Calhoun's case. Can you all think of any abolitionists or even strong anti-slavery people that held office in the federal government, high office? Yeah, neither can I. You knew where I was headed with that, right? Neither can I. Some people may point to John Quincy Adams, but his post-presidential career was when he came out of the closet, the anti-slavery closet. As president, he kept his mouth shut as much as he possibly could on the issue of slavery. So you have this strange scenario where pro-slavery extremists are rewarded in a way that anti-slavery extremists never could have been. And John Quincy Adams hardly was even an extremist, even later in his career. And he's probably the closest we have to getting high federal office. There are some representatives and so forth. Another question for you. Who was the first Northern president to be re-elected? Well, the first Northern president was John Adams, one-term president. Second Northern president was John Quincy Adams, one-term president. And then you have a bunch of non-entities until you get to Abraham Lincoln in 1864 being reelected. And it took half the South, more than half the South, not even voting in 1864. There's a war on. I don't want to give too much away, but there's a war on in 1864. And at least 11 southern states, Tennessee does vote. Quite a few southern states don't even vote. All of the two-term presidents before the Civil War were not only Southerners, but big-time slaveholders. I think the lowest was Madison, who owned like 79 human beings, something like that, at the height of his slaveholding career. Don't quote me on that at all. But they're all big-time slaveholders who are two-term presidents. How did this minority region and this minority population within this minority region succeed in protecting their interests so well? It's a great question, because even the South, even the non-slaveholders of the South are a tiny, not tiny, but a minority. In the 1860 census, there are 31 million people or so in the United States. 8 million of them are white Southerners. 4 million of them are black slaves in the South. And 19 million of them are Northerners. But yet, we have this record of absolute domination. For one thing, there is the overrepresentation of the South in the federal government, more than they would get based on their absolute population, and certainly based on their white population. In the Senate, there's this practice of parity between slave states and free states. When you let in Missouri, then you're going to balance that with Maine. When you let in Arkansas, you're going to balance that with Michigan, and so forth. That makes it so that the South is at a parity with the North in the Senate in a way that they never would have been if you were just counting up people. There's also this infamous and much attacked by Northerners 3/5 clause of the Constitution, counting 3/5 of the Southern slaves towards their weight, Southern states' weight in the House of Representatives. And so, and if that affects their count in the House of Representatives, where else does it also kind of inflate their impact? And the Electoral College. So the South is overrepresented in those very important ways over what they would be just based on white population alone. They also have the advantage of being unified at the federal level. There are no anti-slavery Southerners running around. There's no cracks in the wall of unity that they provide to the rest of the nation. And there's an enormous amount of advantage, as both parties could tell you right now. What they want more than anything is unity. What they dream about and complain that they never get is unity. So if you have unity in politics, you have an enormous amount of influence. Second, they were better threateners than Northerners were, and there were many Northerners who were not prepared to call their bluff. In debate after debate, beginning in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, key Southerners said, if we don't get our way on this particular issue, we're out of here. We're done with the Union. And it wasn't until 1860 that Northerners en masse were willing to call them on that. There were always my current research right now is on a group of Northern politicians known as the dough faces. They didn't call themselves that. You can probably tell. It's not a very flattering term. It came to be known as being soft on slavery. You can press them. They're like Pillsbury doughboys. You can kind of impress your opinions on them. And they were always, and rightfully so, scared that the Union would be broken up over the issue of slavery. Turns out they were right. And as such, because they cared about the Union more than they did anti-slavery, they were willing to compromise. That's part of why they keep the South on its own voting, even with overrepresentation and the unity of the South, never would have won or drawn all these debates if it wasn't for Northern help. And that Northern help generally came because people were truly, deeply, sincerely concerned about the Union and all that it stood for. Those same people then turn around and fight the South when the South breaks up that Union. They care so deeply about Union that is the ultimate cause of the Civil War, as opposed to secession, which is to protect slavery. What is the impact of this Southern dominance of slavery? In many ways, you can see the impact by what happens once they leave. What happens in politics, and especially what happens in the economy once they leave. So I want to shift gears and talk about that. The real era of industrialization in the United States happens after the American Civil War. It is a gross overstatement that you often hear about the industrialized North fighting the agrarian South. Industry is on the rise in the North, but it is nothing like it reaches before. In fact, I think, in 1860, the United States ranked 4th in the world in industrial output. That's respectable, but it's behind Great Britain, which is clear number 1, and then I think Germany or somebody else is in there. And the United States is number 4. So a rising industrial output, almost entirely, but not entirely in the North. And it's not until 1900 that the United States becomes the dominant economic power in terms of industrialization in the world. And there are links to that growth. That's spectacular. Actually, that is in many ways the story of the late 19th century. There are links between the Civil War and policies adopted by the Northern-dominated Congress during the Civil War and this growth. At the very era in which industrialists were talking about laissez-faire, we don't need any help from government, keep your hands off the economy, they got quite a bit of help from the government. One thing that the government did under Republican control, and they did this very quickly after taking control in Washington in 1861, was to raise the tariffs, the taxes on imports for foreign manufactured goods, as not only a revenue measure, but preeminently to protect American industry. And they kept those tariffs in place at a very high level for long after the Civil War, long after they needed the revenue on this tax. In fact, they paid down the debt pretty quickly, and that's my second point. With this tariff income coming in, which is essentially the only source of revenue that the United States had, they paid down the debt on the war that they used to finance the war very quickly, which I know sounds crazy. I mean, I know it's a 19th century story. It's not a 21st century story. A government committed to paying down its debt. I know it's ludicrous. But the way they did that, it had an impact on American society. The people who were willing to invest and able to invest in large amounts in the U.S. war effort, especially when it looked really bad in 1861 and 62 and 63 and 64, were patriotic industrialists and patriotic bankers and would-be captains of industry. So there's an enormous amount of patriotism that gets rewarded in great measure after the war. The way that they pay this debt down with interest very quickly in the years after the war. They're committed to a balanced budget, but a side effect of that is that it puts an enormous amount of capital in the hands of these patriotic elites in the North. And they turn that money into industrialization and into the railroads and the banking sector and so forth that fuels post-war economic growth in the North. They actually retired the debt. Essentially, it was retired by 1885, which, 20 years is not a very long time to pay down an enormous amount of debt that they accrued during the war. And they paid those bondholders premium prices. So the private sector is the preeminent beneficiary of the way they financed and then paid down the debt on the war. And this rapid industrialization with an enormous push, actually a dual push from the federal government, completely impacts American life, but especially Northern life. To highlight that, let me tell you the story of how we got time zones. And it's Sunday that we changed to daylight savings, so time zones are on our mind. If you live in Arizona, you're not really part of the United States, and all that sort of thing, but the rest of us are, so we change our clocks and so forth. We got time zones not from the federal government, but from railroads. It wasn't until World War I that the federal government caught up and said, you know what, I think this is a good idea. Let's just make it official. But the railroads had dictated. It speaks to the power of railroads and corporations in post-war American life. They wanted regularity. Before that, local time meant local time. You know, in Ypsilanti, Michigan, it could be 12:04, and in Ann Arbor, it could be 12:06. That's why you have that clock in the center of town. I don't know exactly how they determined it was 12:06. Had Zeke go out and look at the sun or something, or feel his trick knee. I think it feels like 12:04 to me. I don't know exactly how. But that's quaint. But if you're a railroad, you kind of want to be able to predict when you're going to arrive in town. And so they push for this national kind of culture of regularity. They're not the first. There's a reason Greenwich Mean Time is the center of the world. The British pioneer this idea of regularity for the same reason. It's an industrial maneuver, and it suggests the power of these corporations. And it has an enormous cultural impact. I highlight the culture of regularity, that we know the fact that we are governed by the clock in a way that Americans were not. And to a degree that Americans were not before this massive industrialization. And that culture of regularity actually begins for most Northern men in the Union Army. You know, coming from the farm where the seasons and daylight regulate your daily routine, to military discipline. There's a nice book called Warriors into Workers that talks about how this culture of regularity and being governed by the clock and so forth begins for many of these guys in the Union Army, and then they take that to the kind of industrial discipline that the industrialized economy required. But it also speaks to the power of corporations. The railroads, the term railroading legislation comes from this era, and it speaks of if a railroad wanted something to happen, it was going to happen. And they had their ways of making it happen. We had big business in this country, as you see by some of the rankings in the world and so forth, long before we had big government. And so when the railroads speak, certain things happen. In fact, I love this example in 1895. Not the kind of bailout we're used to. In 1895, the United States government was nearly broke, and they turned to a private investor, banker J.P. Morgan, to bail out the federal government. That's kind of a nice, interesting reversal of what we've seen in recent years, where the bailouts go the other direction. This is just one example, kind of the impact of industrialization with federal policy influencing it, of how economic development, and with all its social and cultural impacts on American life, was now going to be on Northern terms in a way that it never had been before the Civil War. And most of the policies that made this so were in place with the first Congress that took office during the Civil War. Because of the vagaries of the election calendar and so forth, these guys didn't come in until late 1861, well after Abraham Lincoln had been inaugurated and the war had begun. But the 37th Congress, in many ways, well, I'm not going to say in many ways, was probably the most important Congress in the history of the United States in terms of its impact on American life. One Civil War scholar, James McPherson, wrote, the 37th Congress did more than any other in history to change the course of national life. This Congress drafted the blueprint for modern America. That sounds familiar. The blueprint for modern America. I've heard that somewhere. By shifting power from Southern planters and their ability to obstruct certain economic legislation to the North, they had this legislation that they passed. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. He writes, did indeed help fashion a future different enough from the past to merit the label of revolution. What legislation is that? Well, it begins with a couple of acts known as the Confiscation Acts, whereby they are confiscating Southern slaves. They passed the first one in 1861. It's one of the first items of business where they confiscate Southern slaves as property, just like you would, as militarily valuable property, just in the way that you would confiscate a cannon or a musket. They saw Southerners using their slaves, coercing their slaves to dig ditches, to build entrenchments and so forth. And they said, the Union military commanders said, well, if they can do that, we can take their slaves, free them, and turn them to military uses on the northern side. So in fact, this Congress is well ahead of Lincoln. Lincoln signs these acts into law, but it's Congress that initiates this well before Lincoln has embraced emancipation by the summer of 1862. And this is a massive confiscation of a very important form of property, and points Union policy. Union policy that had been dominated by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 with its draconian penalties on anyone who you got jail time as well as a fine for aiding, or actually for refusing to aid in the return of a fugitive slave. That's federal policy. Before this, they completely overturn that and make it so that slaves who run to Union lines will be confiscated from their masters and freed and turned against their former masters. Really interesting piece of legislation, especially in the development of the West. Professor Brian Cannon in our department has done quite a bit of research on the Homestead Act and its impact on Western development. Was passed by this same Congress. This is one of where it grants 160 acres of public land to settlers who lived on that land for 5 years and did some kind of improvement to the land, like chop down a tree or something. It's essentially handing out free land for people who were willing to live there 5 years, and 160 acres, pretty big lot for most people's point of view. Interestingly enough, Southerners before the war had vigorously opposed homestead legislation. This is a big part of the economic program of both the Whig Party and then the Republican Party. And Southern Democrats consistently, in very openly kind of north-south terms, opposed this. One Mississippi newspaper spoke for many of them, said, "Better for us that these territories should remain a waste, a howling wilderness, than to be settled by Yankee homesteaders." Their expectation was that it would be small-time northern homesteaders that would take advantage of this rather than Southerners. So as much as they're concerned about the scramble for the West, they do believe that the Homestead Act would be disastrous for Southern economics. And so they opposed it. The second they leave and a Republican-dominated Congress comes in, they pass it. Same thing with land-grant colleges. Excuse me. This is also an old Northern idea. It had been pushed by Republicans. Let's take some of the land that the United States owns in the West, grant that to colleges or to states. They can sell that land and take the proceeds and improve higher education. Southerners expected Yankees to benefit from that far more than they would. And so they consistently and very openly opposed the idea of land-grant colleges. It passes in July 1862, pretty easily, by a Republican-dominated Congress. And hence you have these land-grant colleges, the best of whom are in the North. University of Illinois, the University of Wisconsin, the University of Minnesota, the University of California system, and so forth and so on. Another thing that they differed over quite a bit was so for many years, Southerners had opposed federal funding for any railroads. One Southerner, John Randolph, total piece of work, from Virginia, had said, if you can, get this, he was debating, what they were debating was a bill to survey a road. It was in 1824. Not to build a road, but to pay for surveyors to go out and survey a road. He said, if you can build a road based on this loose construction, he said, where in the Constitution does it say Congress has authority to build a road? It doesn't. Or to survey a road. How can you justify it? By some kind of loose construction of the Constitution. So if you're going to loosely construct the Constitution to build a road, he said, if you can build a road, if Congress has authority to build a road, Congress has authority to emancipate every slave in the United States. It sounds crazy, but it's that kind of strict constructionist, if you can't cite me chapter and verse in the Constitution, you can't do it, including surveying a road. So many Southern, especially Southern Democrats, had opposed any federal funding, any federal aid, even land grants or anything to railroads or to canals or even to roads, like better roads. They're not muddy the whole year round or frozen the other half of the year. Eventually, the idea of a transcontinental railroad came to be a consensus measure, but then the debate was, where is it going to go? Is it going to take a predominantly southern route like I-10 or something? Or is it going to take like an I-40 or something? I-70 route? Or is it going to take an extreme northern route like an I-80 or an I-90 or something? This had been hotly debated for decades. South leaves, North builds a northerly railroad. They go essentially the I-70 route. That's why it goes through Promontory Point in Utah, northern Utah. They build a northerly railroad route that ends up in San Francisco. Done. South leaves, we get it done. And it's hidden behind this map. That's some PowerPoint wizardry. Just imagine it says a northerly route for a railroad. In politics as well as in economics, the shift in power could not have been more stark as a result of the Civil War. I asked you earlier who the first northern president was that was reelected. Try this question. Who was the first, by southern I mean from the Confederate States, southern president, not just reelected, but elected president of the United States after the Civil War? I'm sorry? Carter was, Wilson kind of Southern. He was from Virginia, but he was governor of New Jersey before he was president. I'm not going to count him. It's actually before Carter. Yeah, it's LBJ. It's not until 1964, full 100 years, after Lincoln was reelected president. Yeah, he kind of Southern, but Missouri was not a Confederate state. It sent plenty of people to fight for the Confederacy. It was a divided state. So you could kind of count him. You could kind of count Wilson, but I'm going to count LBJ. How about this? When was the first Southern, from the Confederate states, president to be reelected? It was Bill Clinton in 1996. That's right. I mean, it's a total reversal at the level of presidential politics to what you saw. And, in many ways, maybe the South is back because then you get George W. Bush. So you get two hailing from former Confederate states. Of course, now you just got a bunch of Yankees running for president. And this is true in other branches. There's some pretty dramatic documents, especially in the first half century or so after the Civil War ended. Or numbers here, as you can see there. Southerners are completely dominated on the Supreme Court, are completely dominated. The North holds 24 of the 31 Supreme Court appointments. And so, same thing with House speakerships. If you look at the cabinet, even the cabinet, which used to be very carefully calibrated between North and South, dominated by Northerners. And same thing with presidential tickets. In the pre-Civil War era, if you nominated a Northerner for president, you'd better nominate a Southerner for vice president. Even Lincoln did that in 1864. He ran as a Union candidate and kicked Hannibal Hamlin from Maine off the ticket and took this disastrous pick of Andrew Johnson. Terrible consequences for American history from that pick. But it's very much in keeping with the old idea that you balance North and South on the ticket. Not anymore. 0 Southerners are nominated by the major parties. The Populist Party runs a Southerner at some point, but I'm talking about the major, the two parties, Democrats and Republicans. This is, one historian has put it this way. Never in the history of this country, and rarely in the history of any country, has there been a comparable shift in the geography of political power. And this despite the fact that actually the 14th Amendment nullified the 3/5 clause and counted all African Americans as full citizens. So it actually went from African American slaves being represented as 3/5 to now African American citizens being represented as 5/5. So actually the Southern representation jumped as a result of this in the House and in the Electoral College, but they are completely dominated. In many ways, this has to do with there's no more doughfaces. Northerners are not interested in compromise with the South anymore. They had that whole Civil War thing. And Northern candidates instead are doing what they call raving the bloody shirt. How can you vote for a Democrat? Republicans are big on this. How can you vote for a Democrat when it's their party that caused this Civil War? And they would actually literally wave bloody shirts. My brother was killed wearing this shirt. Look at all that blood. That's Democratic blood. I mean, it's remarkable stuff. The days of the compromising doughface are gone, and that's why you have these kinds of numbers. Are you guys ready for one of my favorite maps in the whole history of the world? If you look at the sum total of all this, not only in terms of geographic balance of power, but also the trajectory of the development of the economy, you get these two maps. We are accustomed to thinking of the South as the poorest region of the country. But the yellow states on this map are the poorest states, followed by orange, and then followed by, I don't even know what color to call that. What color do we want to call this thing? Magenta. I like magenta. I can barely pronounce fuchsia, so I'm going to go with magenta. I mean, look at this, and the deepest magenta are the top 10 leading states. Now, this is a measure of per capita wealth, and the deep southern states, the Cotton Belt, were the wealthiest region, along with the New England Mid-Atlantic seaboard. But if you look at any particular region that dominates in terms of per capita wealth, it is the deep South. And interestingly, in that count, slaves count both as wealth and as capita, as people. So they kind of balance themselves out. The South had far more millionaires than the North did at the time of the Civil War. In fact, the highest concentration in the 1860 census, the highest concentration of millionaires was actually in Natchez, Mississippi. It wasn't New York or Boston or any of that sort of thing. Actually, in the 1860 census, 2/3 of America's wealthiest men lived in the South. Whereas in 1880, and it's remarkable, turnaround, all the yellow is in the South. And even orange is rare in the North. And all the wealthiest regions are in the North, wealthiest states per capita are in the Northeast. Every time I hear some white Southerner run around talking about how the South shall rise again, I wonder, really? I mean, how did it work out for you the first time? In terms of power, in terms of your control over government, in terms of per capita wealth, and so forth. There's a whole variety of things that go into the making of this map. But I submit to you that it's a remarkable story. And I think that's where I want to end my particular story. I submit to you that this is one of the great transformations in American history, and this alone, let alone emancipation of 4 million slaves. And those 4 million, in terms of just basic economics, the 4 million slaves, if they, their market value, if they were all sold at market, and that's their essential value, the Southern credit system was based on slaves as collateral, far more than land as collateral. So the whole Southern credit system collapses with emancipation. But the billions of dollars tied up in slave property was worth more than all the money in all the banks in the United States, plus all the money in circulation in the United States, plus all the money invested in railroads and manufacturing in 1860. And that, there's no segment of the economy we can even imagine that is like that today. And that form of property in 1865 is wiped out with no compensation to the slaveholders. That alone is a fundamental reorganization of the American economy. along with all the other things that I've suggested. So American politics and economy are changed forever by the Civil War. Thank you for your attention. Thanks. I wanted to make sure I left time for question and answer if you all have any questions.
Have you given this lecture south of the Mason-Dixon line?
No. I've talked about this stuff in Maryland, which was an interesting mix of, because when I was a graduate, his question was, have I given this lecture south of the Mason-Dixon line? No. And in fact, part of what I like about teaching at BYU is that so many of my students are from the South compared to at Eastern Michigan. At Eastern Michigan, I love it when I teach a Civil War class and sometimes even in the U.S. survey to have debates about what the Confederate flag means. Does it mean heritage? Does it mean racism? And so forth. The problem at Eastern Michigan is everybody agreed with me, and that's kind of boring. Whereas at BYU, for some reason we have a lot of students from North Carolina, but various Southerners who take my class, and it takes them a while to warm up to contesting these things with their professor, but I do find it fun to do.
I also had a follow-up on as far as your topic of Civil War being a blueprint for modern America.
Right.
Just from casual reading, I noticed in the 1960s a number of columnists began to look at Abraham Lincoln in a light very different from the deified
Right.
image that is traditional, and that is his inaugurating a version of statism that
Right.
hadn't been observed since then. And that has culminated from an article or an essay or an opinion piece here and there to Di Lorenzo's book,
Right.
The Real Lincoln.
Right.
What's your perspective on his view?
Okay. You may have all heard it, but maybe the film didn't. So I'll try to rephrase the question in a way that will be helpful for the millions who will be watching this on video at some point. The question is, this idea of a blueprint for modern America. How did the Civil War, and particularly Lincoln's policies, impact the growth of the central state of the federal government? And that beginning in the 60s, but it's a growing trend actually to see Lincoln. It's more popular, I've noticed, amongst certain circles to blame the progressives in the early 20th century for the growth of the modern state. But and culminating with this book, The Real Lincoln by Thomas Di Lorenzo. A brief comment on Di Lorenzo is that no academic that I know of takes that book at all seriously. It's the point where if you engage with that book, it seems like a waste of time, because it is so incredibly tendentious and one-sided and not careful scholarship in the least. But it is also true that Lincoln and the Union government actually contribute inordinately to the growth of the state in the United States. I was not going to do this, but you give me the opening. I was going to have a whole thing here on the growth of government during the Civil War. It's like he's a plant. Can you take some time and do this? Some of the numbers are mind-boggling, actually. The total federal budget was $63 million. Can you imagine this? $63 million was the whole federal budget in 1860. By 1865, it was $1.2 billion. That's a 19-fold increase. That even puts like World War II or the New Deal to shame in terms of exponential growth in the cost of government. The war cost the government $20 billion, which sounds like chump change to us. I mean, the federal government spends $20 billion like overnight. But that's in 1860s money, and you have to consider, I love this, between its founding and the start of the Civil War, the federal government's entire expenditures were about $4 billion. And in the war itself, they spend 5 times that. One person, journalist, tried to figure out where's all this money going. So he went just to U.S. Grant's army in 1864 in Virginia and kind of analyzed the costs. And he argued, he found that to feed Grant's horses cost $1 million a month. He concluded, 50 years ago, the whole government did not cost more than what was paid last year for forage for the horses of one of its armies. The entire federal budget was less than $1 million, apparently, 50 years before that. And a lot of people argue, but that's just necessary war expenditures. And then, look, they paid the debt down, and expenditures go back, and actually the federal government shrinks after. But actually, the Civil War, in terms of a blueprint, what the Civil War does is provide a blueprint for an activist state in American life. Because in many ways, emancipation is the mother of all activist interventions, right? I mean, wiping out those billions of dollars of property, I just gave you, a sense of the scale of this. And so after this, every reformer imaginable points to emancipation as their model. And so if you lived in Civil War America, post-Civil War America, if you were a worker, you certainly felt the hand of the federal government intervening against strikes. If you were an Indian, you didn't think this was a small, limited federal government. If you were a Mormon, you did not think, the federal government's this kind of hands-off institution. It's really the territorial government I have to deal with. I mean, it's no coincidence, actually, that Justin Morrill, he who... from Vermont, he who pioneered the homestead legislation, was also the author of the, what's the name of it? The Morrill Act for the Suppression of Polygamy, passed in 1862 by the same federal government. But, people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, this famous novelist, said, emancipation is our model for what we should do in Utah. You see a crying social evil, the federal government goes in and strikes it down. And so Lincoln and emancipation come to be this kind of rallying cry for people who would want an interventionist state after the war. And the growth of the kind of scope of the state never goes back to what it was before. Gives them that kind of at least potential mechanism. That makes a great question. Other questions? Yes. Oh, that's good. 3% total. So it's a fraction that's like 1/8 or something like that of the slaveholders owned 20 or more. So most of those slaveholders own 1 or 5 slaves or something like that. So 3% of the total Southern households owned 20 or more slaves. And they owned most of the slaves, but they were not most of the white population. So. I think that's part of it. The question was, did Southern wealth translate into Southern political power, despite the fact that they're a minority? A big part of it is. James Henry Hammond, who was a total piece of work as a human being, Drew Gilpin Faust, the current president of Harvard, wrote a wonderful biography, kind of toe-curling biography of this guy. He was possibly best known for saying in the Senate, in I think it was 1858, "Cotton is king." Those Yankees would never dare to touch the Southern economic system. And I think that's an overstatement. He also said the British would never dare to touch cotton. Our global economic power amplifies our political power. He overstated it, given that most Northerners cared more for the Union than they did for the profits of cotton. But they cared about both. And so did the British. And there's been a lot of really good scholarship recently talking about the global imprint that the South had as a result of its economic prosperity. And more than anything, the impact of that is it gave Southerners the confidence to try this crazy gamble of secession. But it also, before the war, the short answer to that is before the war, it did expand their perceived political power and people's willingness to call their bluff on disunion and so forth. Right. Her question was about. Oh. We should spend more time looking at this map, so I'm going to put it back up. About whether, as I understand your question, is did the abolition of slavery and that enormously important form of property help explain this shift? And it does in two important ways. One, the absolute value of those slaves in terms of the whole share of property in the United States. It is the second most important form of property in the United States, next to land. It's the second most valuable form of property is in human beings in 1860. But also, what I mentioned in passing, the Southern credit economy is based on the idea of slaves as collateral. Lenders were far more willing to accept the market value of slaves as collateral for debt than they were land in the South. And so what you see after the Civil War is not only the emancipation of all that form of property, without any compensation. The British, when they abolished slavery in their holdings in the 1830s, they compensated them, not the slaves who had worked all those years. It wasn't reparations. It was the masters for this loss of property. The U.S. government does not do that in 1865. It's uncompensated, overnight emancipation. But also, the Southern credit economy is in ruins. A lot of people point to, what Sherman did with all those railroads and things, and they burned Richmond and all that sort of thing. That's what brought the Southern economy to its knees. They actually recovered from that pretty quickly. But the Southern credit economy, they're trying to figure out what is going to be the new basis of our credit economy. And actually, what they decide is the crop itself. We will accept a share of the crop as collateral. So it goes into what they call the crop lien system. And it's now the form of collateral is on the kind of future produce of that land. And most of the lenders, ultimately, there's a whole supply chain, as there always is in credit. Most of the lenders, Northerners now. And so actually, after the Civil War, a lot of Southerners start complaining that they are a colony of the North. They produce the raw materials that colonies around the world produce, and Northern financiers and capitalists are the ones who benefit from it. That is certainly true after the Civil War, certainly very untrue before the Civil War. So it has these spin-off effects, as well as the direct effect of emancipation. Any other? Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. New questioner, and then.
Well,
Yeah.
Back to your maps here. Is it also a factor that the demographics shifted in that the numbers were no longer counted as 3/5, and so the actual percentage of the wealth in the South was spread out to a larger population?
Yeah, and per capita slaves, ex-slaves now no longer count as wealth. They count as people.
Count as a larger number in the population.
Right.
And so the value that was left behind was spread out amongst the larger population.
Well, in a way, I mean, but it's
Not
more
literally,
true.
but
Right.
with-
Right. Yeah, it's. I think that impact from 3/5 to 5/5, ultimate impact is in the House of Representatives in the Electoral College. Although the South doesn't see any benefit from that because of Northern domination of politics thereafter.
But is that a factor in the shift in these colors?
I haven't really thought of it. It may be. All of the economic historians that I've read have emphasized the impact on the credit economy and on where the profits from cotton are flowing now and so forth. That doesn't mean that wasn't true. Yes?
Sorry, this is a bit more hypothetical, but according to your research, according to your knowledge, what would have happened if the South had won the Civil War? How influential would it? Because it seemed like all those changes that you mentioned from the 37th Congress, they were enacted during the war.
Right.
But what would have been the impact if now you have a divided continent?
Right. That's a really interesting question, because if they won the war, it's not like they would have reversed the Homestead Act. Or reverse the land grants, or reverse the northern route of but they would have had control over their own Congress to be able to impose their own economy on their own region. And they also had imperial aspirations. The South had always been an expansionist region, that had started from these little states hugging the Atlantic coast to this enormous empire. And so they had their sights set farther south. and so forth. So what, the thing about hypotheticals is I can't be wrong, so I'm just going to venture my guess, is it that you would, instead of this unified capitalist economy across this entire continent all the way out, to here and beyond, we would have gone back to a scenario where you have rival economies vying for control and influence on this continent. And some people have argued that, or surmised that slavery would have gone away, and so the South would have gone in a more, modern economic direction anyway had they won. But slavery had proven to be very durable and adaptable. You don't have to be a growing cotton to be a slave. In fact, there are, by some counts, 27 million slaves in the world today. Very few of whom are growing cotton. They are working in the sex trafficking industry, the prostitution industry. They are working in agriculture of a whole variety of ways. They're working in factories. They're working on fishing boats and so forth. So slavery. So there's nothing non-modern about slavery. So you would have had slave versus free into the foreseeable future, and rival economic. Instead of all these policies having an impact on the South and essentially being imposed on the South, you would have had them setting their own economic trajectory.
Mine had to do with the earlier economic question, and embedded in your response is a plug for an upcoming event, and that is because the economy was collapsing even during the war, the Southerners made an ill-fated attempt to get gold from Southern sympathizers in Virginia City, Nevada. And in the film series that accompanies the exhibit, we're showing in February a film, a Warner Brothers film with Errol Flynn called Virginia City, that dramatizes that event to get that money. And Errol Flynn is a Northerner, by the way.
Oh, okay. So he's all right. Okay.
We're showing that in February.
Okay. Yeah, great. I mean, for the viewing audience, Virginia City in February. That's the name of the movie also, Virginia City?
1940 Warner Brothers.
Right. And that's one thing, I haven't studied the West in the Civil War very much, but what strikes me in the history of the West in the Civil War is all manner of daring do and kind of Confederate agents and Union agents kind of clandestinely doing all kinds of shenanigans and so forth. And that would be fit with my overall, I would watch that movie and it would not change my image of the Civil War in the West as this really kind of swashbuckling sort of scenario.
But it would raise your image of Errol Flynn.
Okay. Well, my image of Errol Flynn is always very high. My dad was a huge Errol Flynn fan, and so I grew up watching Captain Blood and all kinds of horrors growing up.
Well, let's thank Professor Mason.
Thank you.